Hello, this is for journal entry number 3. So the first article was Becoming 100% Straight. This article focuses on a topic in sociology referred to as studying up. So the studying up, this refers to studying up the power structure, in this article particularly studying up on the social construction of masculinity in sport. So the subject of this article is arguing that although we have begun to study up on corporate elites in sports, whiteness, on masculinity, is now time to extend that studying up on heterosexuality. So the author conducted research by doing memory work with a group of men, 3 of whom were heterosexual and 3 of whom identified as gay. Memory work involves reflecting on certain memories from childhood and gaining a general understanding of and raising new questions about the social construction of heterosexuality and masculinity. So the author said that he had always thought of himself as 100% heterosexual, but after further reflection realized this wasn't necessarily true. He reflected back to a memory of having fascination and infatuation with a friend named Timmy, who was a teammate, and him and Timmy became friends, and then that kind of switched and he began to bully Timmy and tease him. And he mentioned that he had always dreamed of dominating in basketball, but realized he just wasn't aggressive enough. And one day he decided to elbow Timmy in the stomach as a way to kind of assert his dominance or aggression. After reflecting on this, he realized that he in fact had some homosexual feelings or desires for Timmy and decided to kind of assert his aggression as a way to assert his masculinity over the situation. He calls on Kinsey's idea of fluidity and changeability of sexual desire over life course, meaning that large numbers of adult heterosexual men had previously, as adolescents, experienced sexual desires for males, but the Freudian theory of bisexuality suggests that all people go through a stage early in life when they are attracted to people of the same sex. Adult experiences eventually lead most people to shift their desires to an appropriate love object of the opposite sex. The author compared his experience to what Rich called the institution of compulsory heterosexuality, meaning perhaps the extremely high levels of homophobia that are often present in boys' and men's organized sports led him to deny and repress his own homoerotic desires through rejection of Timmy. He then interviewed a former Olympic athlete, Tom, who came out as gay after retiring as an athlete. Comparing experiences, he came to the conclusion that although their situations were different, they were both similar in the sense that both as young male athletes, they were doing heterosexuality. They weren't simply just heterosexual. So they were performing it in an attempt to avoid stigma, embarrassment, or ostracism within the constraints of a socially organized system of power and pleasure like sports. The second article was To Veil or Not to Veil. This article highlights Muslim women's motivations for veiling and how some women choose to veil and some women choose not to veil, and motivation for veiling can vary drastically. Some women veil to express their strongly held convictions about gender differences. Others are motivated to do so more as a means of critiquing Western colonialism in the Middle East. Two aspects of Muslim theology examined in the article and in reflection with veiling are the Quran and the Hadiths. I've heard of the Quran, but I had never heard of the Hadiths before, so that was something new that I read about. Um, Many Muslim clergy and Islamic elites currently prescribe veiling as a custom in which good Muslim women should engage. One of the main views taken is that men are particularly vulnerable to corruption through unregulated sexual contact with women, and that the veil is the regulation of that contact. Um, Veiling is also defended on non-sexual grounds, such as obedience to the religion of Islam, clear indications of um, clear indications of essential differences between men and women, and a reminder to women their places in the home, and just being a sign of a devout Muslim. Islamic feminists reject these ideas, arguing against gender conceptualizations that construe veiling as the ultimate standard by which spiritual welfare and religious devoutness of Muslim women should be judged. So overall, the article compares women who choose to veil and wear the hijab and then women who choose not to. Um, the women who choose to veil most often report doing so to abide by the Quran and by their religious beliefs and to be a good Muslim woman. They feel it protects them from men, enables them to act in the public sphere without receiving negative attention from men, and they also report doing so because their friends did it, and it builds a sense of community. I can kind of see what they were talking about when one of the women reflected to having class or attending class in college with this guy who's rude to a lot of women, and would make remarks to them. And then when she walked by him in the hallway, she got a little nervous to walk by him, but he looked down at the ground when walking past her, and didn't really acknowledge her or say any of those rude remarks that he had done to the other female students. And in that sense, I do see that, because I know as a woman who does not veil or wear a hijab that sometimes you do get unwanted attention when you're just trying to go throughout your day or do certain things, and you wish that that didn't happen. But ultimately, I can see the other perspective of that shouldn't really be a woman's responsibility. That should be, a man should be able to control himself. Muslim feminists argue that the wearing of the veil proposes the idea that men can't control themselves, and that it is a woman's responsibility to make up for it, and that they also propose that veiling didn't even really originate from Muslim tradition. So they argued that it originated back to a completely different culture and religion and society, and therefore it shouldn't be the symbol of a devout Muslim woman when it wasn't even originated, when it didn't originate from Muslim tradition. Overall, after analyzing women who choose to veil or not to veil, both women were hesitant to critique one another and viewed each other as sisters regardless. So the women who did veil and the women who did not veil, although they had differing views and opinions on their choices to do so, they weren't really comfortable to critique the other for what they chose to do, because ultimately they saw each other as like Muslim sisters. The next article was What It Means to Be Gendered Me. This article examines gender from the perspective of a woman who is commonly mistaken for a man. So she states that her daily experiences are a testament to the rigidity of gender in our society, to the real implications of two and only two when it comes to gender categories. So she states that she regularly enacts a variety of practices to either minimize the need for others to know her gender or to deal with their misconceptions or confusions. The article states that we apply gender labels for a variety of reasons, one being that successful social relations will require all participants to present, monitor, and interpret different genders or gender displays. And it kind of said in the article, for instance, like a woman has to evaluate and interpret if a man is a man to kind of determine whether that person is a threat or not. And I can see that extent of it definitely, because, walking down the street at night, you kind of evaluate when you see someone walking towards you. Is that a man or a woman? Am I safe or unsafe? I've definitely done that a handful of times. Lorber says that we have no social place for a person who is neither woman nor man, and we assume that we can place each individual into one of two mutually exclusive categories in a binary system. Gender is seen as a display or a performance, and these displays are culturally established sets of beliefs, behaviors, appearances, mannerisms, and other cues that we have learned to associate with members of a particular gender. And it states that a person who fails to establish a gendered appearance that corresponds to the person's gender faces challenges to his or her identity and status, and that is what the author kind of explains and discusses within the article. She states that the author states that people who follow gender norms can take their genders for granted, and I can see that simply because I've always identified as a female and as feminine, and that's never been something that I've questioned. And I think that is something I take for granted in the sense that I've never had anybody question whether I was a female or a male, and never have had anybody make mistakes on my gender or treat me differently. I mean, treat me differently because they thought I was the opposite gender. So I can see how that can be taken for granted. The author states that the results of being a woman who is often confused as a male. Using credit cards were a problem for her, using women's restrooms or changing rooms. So when using her credit cards, people would think she was, participating in fraudulent activity or attempting identity fraud, and would question her using restrooms and changing rooms, and women would get anxious around her or call her out for entering those spaces. She also became aware, on the other hand, how since she is kind of assumed to be a man, she became aware of nonverbal communication aspects of how men communicate. So she noticed that walking through her brother's dorm, one of the guys kind of made eye contact and did a one-head nod or a one-time nod. And that is something that men do with one another, and that's something she picked up on because she was assumed to be a man. She realized the implications that come from being perceived as a man and possibly having to defend herself from other men who perceive her as a man and exhibit male anger towards her. So, for example, she was talking about how a guy was screaming at her through the car window because he thought he thought that she was a man, and so therefore he exhibited the anger he would with another man, and it was just a whole situation. She states that because of her appearance, much of her negotiation of interactions with strangers involves attempts to anticipate their reactions to her. So I can imagine that would be pretty exhausting, constantly not just being able to freely and openly communicate, but having to anticipate how others are going to react to you. She states that even if she tries not to do gender, someone will do it for her or attribute a certain gender to her. She thought that all the inconveniences she was enduring meant that she was actually doing something to bring down the gender structure that entangled all of us, but after that kind of realized that she might not actually be challenging gender after all because of the way in which doing gender works in our two and only two gender system. Gender displays are simply read as evidence of the two categories. Therefore, gender bending, blending, and passing between the categories doesn't question the categories themselves. Although she would like to see destruction of our current gender structure, currently she would like to expand the category of women to include people like her. So I think the one thing that I was thinking about from this article was the neighbor who lives below me. Not the nicest person in the world, and she definitely looks like a male, and one day my boyfriend and I were in the apartment, and I don't think we were being particularly loud, but that could just be a biased opinion. Anyways, there was a knock on the door, and I asked my boyfriend if he could go see who was at the door through the peephole. And he came back to me and he was like, I don't know, it's some man just standing at the door. And I was like, what do you mean some man standing at the door? And he was like, I don't know. It like he looks like a cop but not in a uniform. And I was like, okay. And so I went to the door, and it was actually, I knew who it was. It was the woman who lived below me. But I can see how if you don't look a certain way, someone might make a assumption about your gender that isn't necessarily true, and how that would probably be really exhausting. The next article was Cross-Dressers in Cyberspace, Exploring the Internet as a Tool for Expressing Gendered Identity. The authors in this article explore the ways in which the Internet functions to communicate about cross-dressing as a part of a larger cultural discourse surrounding gender. It examines 30 websites of cross-dressers ranging in age from 20s to 50s, but primarily a lot of the users were in their 30s. It states that the internet provides a space for people to express themselves and create their own narrative without risking persecution. The websites examined almost all incorporated photographs with narrative descriptions of the individuals. Many of the participants began their personal page with an account of the first time they cross-dressed, and kind of reflected on the positive feelings brought on by the way the clothing fit or the sound it made, and that was made mention as the basis for ongoing fascination with women's dress. And I thought it was interesting that there was a primary emphasis with a fascination on pantyhose for a lot of the cross-dressers. Another commonality among the websites was sharing fears of exposure or being caught when they were younger. Across all 30 websites, most include journal-like discussions about how their cross-dressing is an integral part of their daily lives. The majority of the cross-dressers in the study are involved in heterosexual relationships and have children. A lot of the websites included them discussing when their significant other discovered that they had been cross-dressing by finding women's clothes or perfume or makeup, and originally thought, oh, you're cheating on me, and then discovered that they were actually using it for cross-dressing purposes, and how the initial reaction was shock and fear and disappointment that they thought their partner might be gay, but then in some cases, it went on to the significant other supporting them and helping them achieve a more realistic feminine look by shopping and helping with makeup, which I thought was interesting. Although most of the users identify as heterosexual, they recall times when being hit on while cross-dressing and having a sense of gratification from it. So they would go out dressed like a woman and get hit on by another man, and they had a sense of gratification or happiness from it, because in their mind it was supporting the idea that they had achieved a realistic feminine identity. A common thread among all the sites is the importance of communicating a believable level of femininity through one's cross-dressed appearance. Each of the 30 websites mentioned that participation in the internet transgender community was crucial to their psychological and emotional well-being, and provided an important resource for them and provided community for them. Another thing these websites provided is a sense of community, like I mentioned, that they're not alone in this, and they didn't feel like they were freaks or aliens or whatever. They kind of normalized their behavior through that. One interesting thing was on page 156, where it mentioned that even those who pass as female do not tend to dress like the typical biological female. Instead, they seem to don on all the trappings of femininity and appear to embrace boldly what many women have been struggling against for decades, the objectification of the female body. And I can see a valid point in that, to the extent that I think for a while women have fought against being objectified or against being looked at as objects. And while I completely understand the expression of somebody who cross-dresses, and I see absolutely nothing wrong with it, I can see the perspective that they're kind of embodying this objectification that women have been trying to fight against. So often these men referred to cross-dressing as helping them get in touch with their feminine side, and perhaps it's stated in the article that perhaps these individuals, through cross-dressing, were able to create a particular understanding of femininity within that specific culture, and therefore were able to get in touch with what is perceived as to be the more nurturing side of themselves, which then contrasts with being perhaps more in touch with their feminine side, since nurturing is seen as a feminine trait. So that wraps up all of the articles from week 3.